I hope everyone enjoyed this second video, and if you'd like to watch it again, the videos are available on the IPS website together with a press release on the survey findings. We'll now move on to our second panel session on the topic Global City. Speakers on this panel will ask how the Singapore story would have turned out if we had taken a different path of economic development. They will also consider if our global city model is sustainable for the future. The chairperson of this panel is Dr. Lee Su-an, Senior Fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the Department of Economics at NUS. I'll now hand over to Dr. Lee to introduce the speakers on this panel. Dr. Lee.
Thank you. It is a privilege to chair this session, the first time I've done so for an IPS conference. My speakers are old friends. They're about 12 years younger than me, but when I was a professor, they often looked up to me as an example. Maybe that's why they became professors too. So anyway, I'm thankful that they followed my footsteps here. And I'm thankful that Janadas asked me because although I taught him, but I think I knew his father better than I know him as a student. So it's good back to be old friends and familiar relationships. This conference has been quite good for me because it prepares me for my class this afternoon at 1:30 at SMU, where I'm going to teach on the changing public policy in Singapore. The difficulty in teaching this class is that my grandson is in the class. So what do I tell him about Singapore? Because he has a totally different perspective as a 22-year-old who has finished national service than what I have. Because I had a very confused upbringing. I carried four passports in my life: the British passport, the State of Singapore passport, the Malaysian passport, and then the Republic of Singapore passport. And I went to 4 universities. I enrolled in the University of Malaya. I graduated from the University of Malaya in Singapore. I worked in the University of Singapore, and I ended up as a professor in the National University of Singapore. But the trouble is, all 4 universities are in the same place in Singapore. So names change, and identities change also. So what is Singapore? So I'm very grateful that this morning we have 2 people who can speak from the vantage view. One is a Singaporean born in Singapore, and one is born in Malaysia, I think, Kong Yam. And Linda has her PhD from Michigan, and Kong Yam from Stanford. So I'm glad that they're able to share their views on Singapore's economy from a global city perspective. So I call on Kong Yam first to give his speech. Thank you, Kong Yam.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to thank IPS for inviting me. And first of all, I'll highlight, of course, that I speak for myself and not the institutions that I'm associated with. My title is Managing Singapore's Globalization and Its Discontents, a Long-Term Perspective. So I would like to basically highlight 3 points, and then I will conclude. Firstly, globalization and its discontents. And secondly, the most important part is I propose a framework and strategy on managing the globalizations, its relative winners and losers in such a way to maintain long-term social stability. And then I highlight a very important point in the era of globalizations. We need to sustain the mothership to make sure it's competitive rather than purely globalization, creating a second wing. You create a second wing, you have to be careful because the whole bird might fly away. So then I will conclude. This is to give some perspective. There are a lot of charts on this, and you can see clearly this one of the charts to show that the real median wages of employed residents in Singapore at the low end has been stagnating, at the higher end is increasing. So there are all kinds of charts. I just picked these simple charts to show the rise in inequality, stagnation at the bottom, And this is basically a global phenomenon, because if you look at the US, you also see the same phenomenon of educated people's higher income increase in real wages, and the low end high school dropout and others declining. And just in case you think that it's largely purely due to foreign workers, this chart shows you the Korean case, the top 10% versus the bottom 10%. You see the inequality has also been rising. Now, one can hardly accuse the Koreans of welcoming all kinds of foreigners into Korea. The only people are the North Korean refugees. And the inequality still go up. So the global dimension, of course, is very, very important. Now, I go on to the strategy of management of maintained social stability. Globalization, in a way, is inevitable and necessary for Singapore to sustain our long-term economic vibrancy. Had things been otherwise, what would have happened? Well, look at Penang. In the mid-60s, the Penang port was bigger than the Singapore port. If you stay in the hinterland, that's what you get. Now, Singapore's port is 20 times larger than Penang. So, we are in this globalization race, and so we are like at top. You know, we need to spin sufficiently of huge angular momentum to make sure that we don't slow down too much. If we slow down too much, the top will wobble. So what are the best management strategies to maintain long-term social stability? Now, globalizations in the case of Singapore resulted in everybody, almost, or I would say everybody, as absolute winners. But the key problem is we also care about relative winners and relative losers rather than pure absolute winners. So who are the relative winners? The government is #1 relative winner because it owns a lot of land. Singapore and global elites and capital, global and local capital. What are the relative losers? The lower 30% of the population that, apart from foreign worker effect, has the regional competitive pressure pulling them down. And of course, some aspiring middle class who like cars and houses, but because of land constraint, are being competed away in this opportunity and squeezed out. Now, our problem is basically this. We have, in order to sustain our global city status, we top up the top. We have targeted, carefully managed inflows of foreign skilled workers. So we top up. Unfortunately, we are a city-state without hinterland, so there's no natural outflows of the local people who are less competitive, whose parents might be more competitive, but the second, third generation not so competitive. No outlet for them to move to smaller towns, less stressful and cheaper area as in larger countries. So you cannot move from New York to Oklahoma, you cannot move from Shanghai to Anhui. So what do you do? Now this creates a tension, and London's versus Scotland is illustrative. London is a global capital. It wants all the global talent and money to come in, so it wants a strong pound. That resulted in deindustrialization in Scotland, and of course the Scots might want to consider independent. That is the present situation. Now there's a deeper lesson for Singapore, no? The Marina Bay Financial Centre and Shenton Way is our counterpart of London. Where is our Scotland? Hougang. The financial centre want global talent and capital to come in. They want a strong Sing dollar. That squeeze the SME in Hougang. But of course, Hougang cannot go independent and declare Teochew as a national language. So what do? They vote for Workers' Party. Now, if there are too many Hougangs, it's a bit risky. So we have to make sure that the center take care of the peripheries. That means the relative winners have to realize that they need to compensate the relative losers to sustain long-term social political stability before the tension intensify. Now, how does we do it, and what are the monitoring mechanisms? We are a small open economy. It's like a balloon bobbing in the turbulent ocean. In my past incarnation, I was chief economist of the government. It's not an easy job, you know, because you keep seeing the volatility. But how do you, and you can see that clearly, you see the external demand is 80%. And if you look at the volatility measures in terms of the standard deviation of GDP from the cycle, the country is getting more volatile. So, but there are strategies. While a balloon bobs in the turbulent ocean, you can tie a rock to the balloon and stabilize it. What are the rocks? Firstly, government should act as a collective risk insurer and risk diversifier, as well as a social and political stabilizer. There is, for example, uncertainty in housing demand. Government should not pass the risk of uncertainty in housing demand to individual households, but it should absorb it. So individually, we might be a small sampan caught in the turbulent ocean. But if collectively we rough it together through government policy, then the things will be stable in the turbulent ocean. What are the key institutions? CPF is one risk insurer and diversifier, GIC, Temasek, and MAS. In addition, I think the subsidies on education, healthcare, housing, and public transport, and food in terms of hawker rentals, especially for the lowest 30%, will be critical. Let me go on to a few points before I consolidate this into a framework for stabilization of Singapore society in the turbulent world of globalization. Firstly, we have a Singapore premium. This brand premium is very valuable. What are the sources of premium? Everybody knows we've got good governance, we've got meritocracy, we've got clean government, we've got multiracialism, we've got openness, we've got great infrastructure, we've got security and robust institutions. These premiums have been built up by generations of Singaporeans and the government, including national service obligations and sacrifices of the pioneer generation. I didn't realize how valuable the Singapore premium is until I worked outside Singapore, where I spent 2 years between 2002 to 2005 working at the World Bank in Beijing, where I worked on the 11th five-year plan with Prime Minister Wen Jiabao. I was given $6 million of research fund to manage, even though I was relatively junior. I was the chairman of the committee, because they think that it's safer to give the $6 million to a Singaporean than to a China, Indian, or US citizen. And I used that $6 million to finance Zhou Xiaochuan, Lou Jiwei, Yi Gang, Guo Shuqing, who are now respectively Governor of Central Bank, Minister of Finance, Safe Head in charge of Reserve. But to clarify, it was purely based on professional criteria of distribution. Now, if you listen to the grouses on the ground, from average person to others, you see clearly that the foreigners benefit from this Singapore premium is one of the grouses on the ground. Foreigners benefit from this premium in a way, conceptually should be taxed and the benefit distributed to locals. It is a McDonald's franchise. I built up this Golden Arch brand. If you want to sell McDonald's, you have to pay me franchise fees. The only problem is in the real world, it's more complicated. Singapore is a price taker. If London and Hong Kong doesn't tax this, can we afford to implement it? That is you know, in McDonald's, KFC, if they don't charge franchise fee, the issue is can BreadTalk ask for a franchise fee? So we have key limiting resource, land, we got vertical supply curve, the cost of space is very high, and we have the haves, the have-nots, and actually one of the problem is in the middle class area, we might have, I would call a never will haves. What do you mean by never will haves? 45% of our household own cars, and there is a constraint in land, which means that if everybody's income rise, the car prices rise as only 45% can own cars, and the rest of 55% can never own it, because it is not possible. Now let me go on to what I see as a good conceptual framework. Time is ticking, so I'll move faster. If you look at this chart, I have basically median nominal monthly income, which is the 50 percentiles income growth every year in nominal terms. I index it at 201 at 100. And then I look at four key costs of living. The first one is food. You can see clearly in some years the income did not cover the food price, but overall, over about 15 years, the income, even at the lowest 50%, has managed to cover food. So that's okay. And then you look at transport. There have been periods of movement of public transport price increase, private transport price increase, but overall, I think the income of the lowest 50 percentile can still manage to cover the transport. If you look at healthcare, this is a bit tricky. You see clearly for quite a sustained period between 2001 to 2010, for almost 10 years, the healthcare cost was increasing much faster than the income of the lowest 50%, and recently it has improved, but this is an area that is likely to flash red lights. Now, housing is the biggest problem. Not many people realize that after the Asian financial crisis, from 1998 to 2007, HDB resale price remained flat or actually went down. But since 2007, you see the enormous increase in HDB resale prices, even faster than private property prices. And it has overshot increasingly the median monthly income. There's a line there called Housing DOS, Department of Statistics, which show that it actually is slow, but the Department of Statistics housing price is according to the UN indicator, which show imputed rental price, so it's not representative. So basically what you have is an enormous overshooting has happened. Fortunately, since 2011, there's credit tightening, the HDB has increased supply, there's a delink of the BTO price from the resale price, and in the last 4 quarters, you see prices falling. But I would argue that public housing should be like utilities and it should not be an asset. And it should move stable with nominal income, because if you look at public housing, if it's an asset and appreciating asset, like internet stock, then you have a situation where the new entrants are angry, but more importantly, almost everybody in HDB are also unhappy, because if HDB prices double and my income do not go up, my ability to upgrade actually become significantly less. So it affects everybody, you know. So I will argue that from the 4 charts that I show, we have to be quite careful in this, because if you look at the housing chart that I showed just now, by 2009, the alarm bell should have rang in HDB, because the resale price has overshot 20% of the income line. By 2010, it overshot 40%. By 2011, it overshot 60%. In fact, if you look at the existing trend, in the next 3 to 5 years, HDB prices need to drop 15 to 20% to go back to the trend line. So I will argue that this framework is useful to provide an early warning system. As all of us know, a lot of us take annual blood tests. The blood tests show you your liver function, your blood pressure, your sugar level, your cholesterol level, and it benchmarks against a normal range. So that if it goes beyond a normal range, immediately you know the problem and you address it. You don't wait until you got a political heart attack and then you start to address it. And this framework can also be refined for the lowest 10%, and you are worried about the middle class for the middle 60%. Everybody got a blood test. Now, to be fair, the government has used a lot of the funds very well. For example, if you look at the 2008-2009 crisis, the government spent 4.5 billion giving the job credit scheme, 5.8 billion stimulating the bank lending, and 20.5 billion package to support the people and the economy during the financial crisis in 2008-2009. As a result of which, it ended up with a big deficits. But the advantage is that employment did not decline very much. And if you look at IMF analysis across the Asian countries, Singapore is the only country where the employment growth recovered very quickly immediately after the Asian financial crisis. And so, in a way, the additional collected money has been spent well. Now, I talk about the sustaining of mothership. The Singapore brand premium is there, so we need to sustain the mothership. Now, what do you mean by sustaining mothership? It is important in the era of globalization. I want to compare Singapore with Taiwan and Hong Kong. Taiwan and Hong Kong economies are not doing well. The wages are stagnating, especially for young graduates. You can see for stagnating wages in Hong Kong. So this explains why, apart from the election practices for the chief executive, they all carry umbrella even though it's not raining there. And you see Taiwanese graduates. Taiwanese graduates, entry-level nominal wages in 2011 was lower than 1997 in nominal wages. So wages stagnating, but Taiwanese and Hong Kong companies are doing very well, no? You look at Hong Hai, you look at Acer, you look at Uni President, you look at the property tycoon in Hong Kong, you look at Li and Fong, you look at Chow Tai Fook. Their profits is enormous and expanding. That is because globalization allows companies and global elites to separate from the mothership. So as I said, it's well and fine to have a second wing. But we have to protect our mothership because that's where our core is, where our people are getting good jobs or not good jobs. So as I said earlier, we encourage second wing, but we have to make sure that the second wing become in such a way that it doesn't cause the whole bird to fly away. Now, okay, I'm overshooting a bit, so I just have one last point. Conclusion. So I suggest we have close monitoring of nominal median income relative to cost of living and housing, transport, food, and healthcare as a way to ensure that the fruits of globalization are properly distributed. And this is an early warning system to ensure that we are alerted to it before things become too late. We focus on the welfare of the relative losers before they want to declare independent. Lower 30% of population and some aspiring middle class, and the government should play its role as a collective risk insurer and diversifier, as well as social and political stabilizer. And we strengthen our mothership to make sure globalization does not create centrifugal forces to tear our societies apart. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Kong Yam. A very good exposition. I agree with many of your views. Yeah. So now over to Linda. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. First, I want to thank IPS for inviting me here and apologize for breaking my toe yesterday. So I cannot stand up there, but I hope you can hear and see me all right here. I came of age during the early years of Singapore's independence, turning 50 in September 1965. So now you know how old I am. Unfortunately, not old enough to be pioneer generation. There was huge fear and uncertainty about what our future would be, cast out on our own during what was a turbulent time in our region and the world. President Sukarno's Indonesia had launched confrontasi against Malaysia, of which we were recently a part. I also had Malaysian passport for a while. The McDonald House bombing had just occurred within earshot of my school, MGS, and we had family friends who worked in the building. The United States was ratcheting up its military involvement in Vietnam, and within a few months, the Cultural Revolution started in China. All of Asia, except for Japan, was still poor, with Singapore already ranked the second richest in the continent. The next bombshell was the announcement of the withdrawal of British military services, which I had had no idea constituted 1/3 of Singapore's GDP, with most of the rest being port, transport, commercial and financial services linked to our role as the regional import-export hub of Southeast Asia. Then came the May 13, 1969 race riots in neighbouring Malaysia. I don't recall when exactly then Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew said, "Pray God my successor is an economist." It's one of those things I have no source for except my own imperfect memory. It was before I knew what economics was, before I studied economics in pre-university, but I decided then that that was what I was going to do with my life, since it was vital to the survival of our small and vulnerable new nation. By 1969, our government had already embarked on a new development strategy, turning away from the then World Bank standard import substituting industrialization for the Malaysian common market already referenced. They had turned from that toward manufacturing for export to the world market instead. The labor-intensive piece of manufacturing for export had already proven itself in other parts of the developing world. Puerto Rico's Operation Bootstrap, Mexico's Maquiladora, export processing zones of Taiwan and Korea, and of course, Hong Kong. This strategy fit with the theory of comparative advantage, which argues that countries should specialize in the production and export of items that intensively use their relatively abundant factors of production. In Singapore's case, a high unemployment rate of around 12% of the labor force indicated that we might be competitive in relatively labor-intensive industries. But this strategy was driven not just by comparative advantage or supply-side factors. Technological and public policy changes in developed countries also contributed to favorable demand-side conditions for labor-intensive manufactured exports from developing countries. These included US trade policy, which exempted US origin value added from import duty, and technological developments in the semiconductor and consumer electronics industries, which enabled offshore sourcing of labor-intensive parts and components of the electronics value chain. I examined this phenomenon in 1975 and 76 through field research for my PhD dissertation entitled manufacturing for export by multinational companies in developing countries, the case of the electronics industry in Malaysia and Singapore. That was 40 years ago. The other industry that Singapore bet big and successfully on was the then also labor-intensive shipbuilding and repair, transforming the abandoned British naval base facilities into shipyards. But both industries did not develop solely because of comparative advantage. Key to Singapore's success here was the parallel development of complementary competitive advantages through strategic industrial policy and strategic social policy. These built on the country's already established economic assets of good location, deep water port, free port status, and commercial and physical infrastructure. They included not just tax benefits, subsidized industrial estates, and a streamlined bureaucracy, but also domestic health, education, housing, and labor policies that dovetailed nicely with the internationally focused economic strategy in terms of raising labor productivity, reducing costs, and ensuring political stability, and more controversially, labor peace, the 1968 Employment Act. I remember interviewing a multinational, and they said, you know, there's a flatted factory in Jurong or something, and they said, when you look out the window, when shift change, you see all these women in blue uniform, and within 2 minutes they had disappeared. Why? Because of the location of industrial estates contiguous to HDB. So people could live and work roughly in the same place. So this shows the integration of social and industrial policy. This development strategy was so successful that in less than a decade, surplus labor in Singapore had been absorbed, labor shortages appeared, and after delay due to the 1975-76 global recession, a second industrial revolution was launched in 1979. The goal here was to increase productivity and wages and reduce reliance on low-skilled labor and mostly temporary foreign labor, which had been imported in the effort to preserve comparative advantage in labor-intensive activities. Sound familiar? These policies were somewhat successful, but carrying them through was again interrupted by another global recession in 1985 and 86. Both comparative advantage and competitive advantage are dynamic forces, changing with respect to external as well as internal market and policy developments. Because of Singapore's small size and high growth rate, dynamic shifts in international competitiveness happen more rapidly here, with comparative advantage in labor-intensive activities yielding quickly to skill and capital intensity. Through the 1980s and 90s, government policy continued to add location-specific competitive advantages, primarily infrastructure, education, and investment incentives, in supporting the move up the value chain, particularly in manufacturing for global markets. Becoming a global city, and specifically a node, very popular at the time, the term, a node in the evolving global supply chains of multinationals, was the best, and I believe the only path to economic development, even survival, that Singapore could have followed with any hope of success 50 years ago. I think we were less than 2 million people then. That said, we were successful in that path, a choice of strategy, because external global forces, including multilateral trade liberalization and the information and communications technology revolution, and internal domestic policies and policy outcomes were favorable. Things on both the external and internal front are very different today, presenting both challenges and opportunities for us in the next 50 years. First, there will be a slowdown, if not a reversal, in the pace of globalization in the next 50 years compared with the past 50. Some of you may know that very recently, world trade growth has fallen to be on par with or below world GDP growth, which it dramatically outpaced in previous decades, the decades when we were embarked on this global strategy. The reasons for what some have called deglobalization are many, including on the supply side, and sorry, I don't want to run out of time, so I'll be a bit fast here. Acceleration in shifts of comparative advantage with automation in situ, taking over from offshoring to more labor-intensive locations as manufacturing wages rise, or China replacing factory workers with robots rather than moving to Vietnam and employing Vietnamese. Okay, so that's the shift, quick shift in comparative advantage. Revolutionary technologies like 3D printing, allowing for mass customization and small batch production at or close to where demand is located and the final consumer resides. So more and more you will have production occurring at the point of consumption. Next, continued shrinkage of the already fractional share of manufacturing in the value chain of physical products like the iPhone, where most of the value is now embedded in services, including design, marketing, software, retail, and the return to capital and profit margin. Okay? There have been several studies of this showing that approximately $600 retail price of iPhone translates into $7 to $8 for manufacturers in China. Okay, so that's a big difference. Producing where you sell is also motivated by desire to save on transport and inventory costs and turnaround time from order placement to delivery, and to reduce currency exposure and risk. Lower marginal benefits from further trade and investment liberalization when most countries and industries have already liberalized, with further liberalization and standardization more likely to take place on a regional than a global level. There are environmental and social policy pressures to reduce carbon footprints and thus to streamline and shrink currently far-flung global supply chain. And the narrowing of competitive advantage differences between geographies based on relative productivity levels, infrastructure, and government incentives is increasingly constrained by international agreements and protocols to level the playing field as economic development proceeds around the world. I'll get into some details later. So on the supply side, there are changes in the world economy that reduce the globalization of multinational supply chains. On the demand side, a slowdown in global macroeconomic growth as the currently rich world ages and stagnates, and booming emerging markets reach a more mature stage of development with slower growth. So both rich countries and developing countries will slow down. There's the shrinking of manufacturing share and the expansion of services share of value added in global value chains as world incomes rise and populations age. And finally, there are social innovations such as the spread of the sharing economy, the on-demand economy, and conservation culture, recycling and longer product lives, buy local norms, and a values shift from materialism to experiential goods. All these add up to slower growth in output, a lower ratio of goods to services in output, a lower ratio of manufacturing to services value added in goods themselves, a greater localization of goods and services production, occurring at much lower levels of per capita income than in the present-day developed world. Welcome to the post-industrial society on a global scale. From a Singapore perspective, these global trends of a deceleration in globalization indicate a need for transformation beyond the global city paradigm that served us well in the past 50 years. Even without a deceleration, there are today many more global cities around the world and in our region than there were 50 years ago, indicating much more supply-side competition in the future than we faced in the past for the kinds of goods and services that a global city provides. Today, the gap in every dimension between the first-tier global cities of Shanghai and New York has dramatically narrowed from even 10 years ago, while Shanghai's share of world GDP has increased even as New York's has shrunk in relative terms. Tomorrow, the same will be true of the gap between Bangkok and other regional cities in Singapore. Domestically, our comparative advantage has already shifted decisively away from labor to capital and skills intensity, as you can see the backdrop to Kong Yam's charts. Despite decades of this adjustment away from labor towards capital and skills to market forces being slowed by compensating policy-created competitive advantages such as a liberal foreign labor and talent policy. Such policy advantages will be ever more difficult to maintain in the face of heightened competition and level the playing field global norms. such as will make incentives for tax-avoiding multinationals no longer acceptable. Fortunately, in addition to the physical, financial, and human capital built up over the past 50 years, we benefit from an excellent geographical location in the center of Southeast Asia, which happens to be the next large emerging market region to develop, after China and alongside India. Global multinationals from Asia, as well as the West and elsewhere, are already turning their attention to this region and investing here, as are Singapore and national companies in our neighboring countries. The tapering off of the 20th century development model of labor-intensive manufacturing for export through multinational networks to distant rich markets will be replaced by domestic consumption-led growth in nearby middle-income markets, as has already begun in China, India, and Indonesia. It is this regional market which is attracting investment by global multinationals, especially from today's slow-growing and rapidly aging rich countries and China. Singapore can build on our natural differentiating advantages versus other global cities by playing a role in regional value chains, regional, not global, catering to the hundreds of millions who are already entering the middle class all around us. Our edge and role is likely to be in value-added services that the wealthy among our neighbors and the world already avail themselves of. What we need to do is cater more explicitly to the much larger numbers just slightly further down the regional income distribution. We can return to our ancestors' commercial roots as multilingual, multicultural entrepreneurs, intermediaries, and service providers for our own dynamic geographical regional market. Put simply, we will move from manufacturing physical goods for customers richer than we are who are far away to providing services to customers poorer than we are who are nearby. The good news is that services for our regional neighborhood are more location-specific and scalable and less capital and energy intensive than manufacturing for distant markets. Services are also less reliant on rare specific technical skills and more open to small entrepreneurs, providing a channel for upward mobility and reduced inequality. How we might propel and manage this transition from one of soon-to-be-many global cities to a one-of-a-kind leading regional city is something I would be happy to discuss, but no time now. All I have time to say now is that we should remember the lesson of our past 50 years, particularly the earlier decades, which showed that properly and far-sightedly managing domestic conditions, including social policy, are necessary for economic success based on past global and forthcoming regional linkages. Chief among the attributes that Singaporeans will need to succeed in this regionalizing market environment is an entrepreneurial spirit that will enable us to create our own jobs rather than slot ourselves into the declining number of jobs that will emanate from foreign companies. As you all know, Facebook, creates like 8,500 jobs in the world, okay? From the 1910s to the 1930s, my great-grandfather, the first of now 6 generations of my family to study in ACS, and beginning with my great-grandmother, also MGS, frequently traveled to and readily conducted business in cities as diverse as his diaries say, Batavia, that is Jakarta, Surabaya, Pontianak, and Shanghai on the one hand, and Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, London, and Paris on the other. While my great-grandfather's younger brother lived and worked for some years in Bangalore and Mysore, as well as Penang, Shanghai, and Beijing. Both were fluent and literate in English, Malay, Mandarin, and several Chinese dialects, and clearly comfortable in many different cultural milieux. There have always been Singaporeans like them, and there should be many more in our next 50 years, as we increase the regional while retaining the global content and context of our city and of our nation's economy. Conserving our multicultural national identity will then go hand in hand with economic progress and social well-being. Wow, I finished before time. Okay, that's it. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
I also agree with her quite a lot. And I was recalling how the greatest benefit that I gained from Singapore in being in Malaysia for 2 years was that I was compelled to learn Malay, and that enabled me to learn the language which my grandfather spoke because he served in Indonesia for 20, 30 years. My mother having been born in Bogor itself. Yeah. So we have very true interesting perspectives, one from the regional orientation of the Singapore economy, and one from the helping the poor, bottom 30% of the Singapore people. And these two dimensions are equally important for Singapore's future. But I'm sure there are many more questions or remarks which you want to make from the floor. So please come to the mic and identify yourself and ask whoever you want to, whatever is in your mind at this moment. Thank you. Who wants to be the first? Oh yes, come, go ahead.
Let me help to get this started. I have two questions. Professor Tan, I wondered whether you have any examples anywhere else in the world of a state that you think has gotten that balance between protecting the mothership and engaging successfully in globalization that Singapore might learn from? Or is this a problem that is endemic and no one's got it reasonably right so far? You've given us some examples of the ones that have got it wrong. I wonder if there were any good examples. Professor Lim, I think your presentation resonated really well with the divides that we saw on the first panel. Ambassador Kausikan's reading of the region, particularly in geopolitical terms, is much more negative than your much more positive reading of the economic future of the region. I think I come down on your side, which also reflects why Bilahari and I had certain disagreements. I wondered whether you see the prospects that Singapore would face a bit of a trade-off. Is it a zero-sum game that one has to make the choice of either being regional focused or global focused? And I wondered if you'd say a little bit more about how Singapore would be competitive against the other important global cities of Asia. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's not an easy balance. And I think one of the reasons why the example that I gave, Taiwan and Hong Kong are having difficulty, is because China is such a large market and economic gravitational forces were so large that it has enormous impact on the private sector and the companies. When I visited Taiwan to talk to some companies some years back about, if their companies relocate to China because of the big market and electronic companies uprooted themselves, what happened to the workers? One of them told me that, well, there are still some domestic services side. For example, there are a lot of graveyards in Taiwan. They have a lot of weeds. So some of them go and uproot the weeds, and because this job would not migrate to China. I think this is a very serious problem because the mothership, unless it's well maintained, all the good jobs for future generations of young Singaporeans will be threatened. So I think the airport is a very important strategic position. We strengthen our airport, our hub city, we strengthen our seaport, we strengthen the regional hub positions like Linda has talked about, so that eventually this little red dot that is geographically well developed and competitive will always be able to generate good jobs for future generation. And I think in some ways, companies, country, in Singapore will have to take a bit more strategic view rather than short-term profit-motivating view.
Thank you, Hong Yong. Yes, later.
Okay, is there a trade-off between focusing on regional or global economic strategies? In economics, there's always a trade-off because you have resource constraints, whether it's land, labor, talent, or capital. You cannot be competitive in everything, okay? If you try and have auto industry, computer industry, education industry, biomedical industry, I don't know, big data center, everything all at once, they will all become uncompetitive, right? Because they will be competing with each other for scarce rents, scarce land resources. They'll be competing with each other for scarce talent, for scarce labor, perhaps for scarce capital, and everybody will become uncompetitive. And that's why there are trade-offs and choices to be made. If you become competitive in A, if you decide to subsidize or protect industry A, that means you are making industry B or sector B uncompetitive, right? That's a choice. That's a basic economic thing. Now, you can try and outrun this for a short period of time by adding the scarce resources. You can go and add labor, add talent, add capital. Globalization enables you to do that, but you ultimately have resource constraint, land, okay? But even the others also become constrained. So in the terms of regional or global, so in general, you have to make choices. This is our theme, right? If you choose to be competitive in A, you're choosing to be uncompetitive in B. Regional or global? Yes, there is a trade-off. Let me just think, I can list a whole bunch. Because we have scarce resources, that is to say, we have a limited number of Singaporeans, new or old, I don't mind, that's two working things. If you are focused on a global strategy, for example, you might want to make sure that your students, when they go on their study abroad, exchange program, etc., learn French and go to France, learn German and go to Germany, learn Japanese and go to Japan. If you have a regional focus, you will have them learn Indonesian to go to Indonesia, Thai to go to Thailand, etc. Okay? So the same student, well, some of them can, but most cannot learn all these different languages. Okay? And Singaporeans, because of our global city mindset, have focused for the last 30, 40 years on the rich West. Okay? I'm sorry, that is not where the future is. Okay? The future is on the middle income Southeast Asia. It always amazes me that we are unable to see that, and we have not changed the mindset of our own school students. In the past, as I said, my great-grandfather, they run all over the place. Okay? I have met Singaporeans trading in like remote places around the world. So we certainly have a history of doing that, but I think that we need to rethink that more. How do we be competitive against other global cities? Exactly the same thing. Right? Why would you locate in Singapore rather than Shanghai? Shanghai is much bigger, going to be much richer, has much more scale, has much more skills, etc. Why would you choose to be in Singapore? I don't think you should choose to be in Singapore because the government paid you to be. That is, subsidize you, because that will eventually fail. Because the market is much more powerful, and we cannot foresee government policies. You be in Singapore because you want to be closer to Jakarta. You don't want to fly 8 hours to Jakarta. You want to fly 1.5 hours to Jakarta. You want to be in Singapore because there you can hire people who know how to work with Indonesians, who can speak Bahasa. Okay? And so it's your local MNCs that I've interviewed over the last 30, 40 years. That's basically what they're here for Southeast Asia. And of course, when Southeast Asia wasn't growing, we don't do as well. But so I think that it's very clear, focus on who you are. what is unique about you, okay? Don't try and compete with Shanghai, New York, whatever, global cities, because you can't, and because you shouldn't, and because nobody will reward you for that. The market will only reward you for your differentiating advantages. What is unique about you, okay? Not what is the same as everybody else, maybe slightly cheaper, slightly better, etc. So we can go into more details, but I'm talking too long already, so I'm going to stop here.
Yeah, thank you. I was reminded by Kong Yam just now that in 1966, the trade handled by Penang was bigger than Singapore. But what happened was that in 1970, when I was appointed to the PSA, we containerized the Singapore port. So the vessels which go to Singapore are container vessels which can only go to other ports which are containerized within Southeast Asia. And not all ports are containerized. Penang, I don't think is containerized here. So this is one example. Maybe when we build a new port in Singapore, we should not just make it a containerized port. Maybe we should go back to a conventional shipping port so that when Indonesia develops its maritime trade, the ships from Indonesia can come to Singapore. Now they would bypass Singapore because it only can handle containerized vessels. There's a big difference between a conventional vessel and a containerized vessel. Another comment I'd like to make, although I'm not a speaker, is that I mentioned this, my learning Malay. Now, people may not have remembered that between 1959 and 69, Singapore had a multilingual policy where you choose to study one other language besides your own, besides English. It's not a bilingual policy. In 1970, it shifted to a bilingual policy. So if you bring back the multilingual policy, you may bring back the study of Malay, because many Singaporeans will choose to study Malay if it is a useful language for business and commerce. But we're now stuck in a bilingual policy where you learn the language of Chinese because your mother is Chinese or father is Chinese. So this is where certain cultural policies have an economic impact. Although we don't realize it, but it has a long-term impact. And I don't know whether our knowledge of Chinese, which is quite good, and this is one reason why I'm still studying Chinese now, whether China would be a magnet for Singapore. Because if you, whether we can actually develop our economy through China. Because if I recall what I teach my students, at one time, Singapore was founded by the British in order to tap the China trade. This was 1819. But after the First Opium War, 1830 to 40, Hong Kong was obtained. And because of that, the China trade shifted to Hong Kong, not to Singapore, which was the British intention originally. And we managed to survive on the entrepot trade, spice trade, for 30, 40 years, until later the rubber and tin trade came into Singapore. So this is a very important example where sometimes an original focus on China, for example, leading to Singaporean students learning Chinese, may not pay off. For all you know, it may pay off learning Malay. This is just one of the responses I can make. Yeah. Any more questions from the audience? Yes. Heng Chik, yes. Please come to the mic.
Okay. I have a question for Kong Yam, and also some comments about Linda's presentation, and I think Evelyn's point that she raised. First question for Kong Yam. First, I fully agree with you that we have to take care of the bottom 30%, and certainly is in the areas that you've pointed out, in the rising cost of living in all the essential areas of healthcare, housing, transport, etc. Unless we do that and tackle that question, it will always be the sore in Singapore, is how to keep up. Now, this is a global question, but we've always done it quite well. And the one thing I can't understand is why we can't sort of do something about rent prices that keep going up, and because I think that affects prices in every other area. But my question for you is this, you talked of government being the risk insurer and, being the insurer for diversification also. Could you elaborate on that? I ask this because in the United States, the US government has an agency that provides insurance for US companies that go overseas to developing countries when they invest there. The US government provides insurance, and very good insurance, where other companies, private insurance companies, would not step in. I tried to get them to cover Singapore as well, but they said Singapore is a developed country. So what is the role you are thinking of, government as risk insurer? That's one. Now for Linda, I think, Linda, if I heard you correctly, you are saying it's a shift in the nuancing. It's not global or regional, but the awareness of the regional role of Singapore must be clearer. I think we've always walked on 2 feet, regional and global. At one time, we were talking of global and everybody was going international. In the 1980s, around 85, was it? We had a big recession, and we realized that if the region didn't do well, Singapore couldn't do well by just being global and turning to the West. Then the awareness that Singapore's economy is very much tied to the health of the regional economies was very clear. And since then, we've been talking of both. I think there should be more emphasis on the emerging markets, because that's where people are, the middle class will grow. It's going to be first and foremost the region, because we know that. I think we are trying to sell also to Latin America, but very few Singapore businesses will go to Latin America. Africa, that's the other emerging market. But really, of course, this is our front yard and backyard, Southeast Asia. So I think it's important, I agree with you, that we should increase this awareness. Too often, holidays, parents are just going to Western countries, Japan, Los Angeles, you know, Florida, that's where Disneyland is, China. But I think there should be more visits to the region, apart from Bali, you know, and Chiang Mai, where the Gubak Kway Teow is very good, you know. So but I think it is still both, because when you think of financial services, our role as a financial center is global, but also regional. And it's only because we are global as well that we can play this regional role. I just wanted to sort of emphasize that, because I think you're coming across as, you know, it's the region and it's not global. I think it's both, but the nuancing must now be regional. Now, finally, to Evelyn's point, I think it was Evelyn who raised it, that, yeah, I'm defending Bilahari. I can't believe it. You know, but I think when you said that you landed more on Linda's court, that regional is important, whereas Bilahari seemed not to believe in the region so much, I think you've got him wrong. He's more pessimistic, and I would say Linda is right and Bilahari is right. He may be saying that the regional politics in the region is not going to be so honky-dory. Economy may be doing very well, but you know, how well economies do also depend on politics in the region. Thank
you. Yeah, thank you for the question. When I mentioned the idea of government being a risk insurer, diversifier, and social political stabilizer, I was looking at it more at the national macro level and government against household. So it is much less in terms of the traditional risk insurers, in terms of financial or, you know, companies and other risks. One example is, of course, that we have a lot of risk in terms of present investment, but if CPF right now has consolidated and bring to GIC and is diversified across globally, then government is playing that role very well. But one negative example I can think of is this. As you're aware, the HDB has suffered quite a serious bad experience from 1997 to 2008 because of the global Asian financial crisis. You know, the demand collapsed, there's enormous excess supply, and there's a big cost to their budget. And as a result of which, they are much more cautious about anticipating demand and coming up with supply, and worried about this excess supply effect and the negative financial side. And it turned out that eventually after 2006 to 2007, when things start to pick up very rapidly and the workers and the residents increase, they were not able to respond sufficiently well to that demand, and price escalated. I would argue that the government, either in terms of HDB, public housing, or other sector, should absorb the shock that you build some excesses into the system, and as long as it is not unduly out of whack, you can absorb some of the costs so that you don't pass the uncertainty and the volatility to the household, and the government should collectively be insurers and stabilizer. And I think the best example that the government performed this role very well was the GFC data that I showed in 2009. The government put in a few $1 billion in job credit scheme to actually subsidize the companies to hire and retain the worker. And that actually allowed the companies not to retrench and create a lot of problems for the families during that period of a shock. And that absorption of the risk cost some money, but I think it's worthwhile spending that money, and there will be a lot of other cases where I would argue that the government should act as that kind of a shock absorber to mitigate against the increasing volatility and the turbulence of the ocean waves onto the household effect.
Linda, any comments?
Oh, she didn't have any question. She just commented. I would say that clearly in my remarks, I said that it's not an either-or, global or regional, except when it comes to allocation of scarce resources, like a secondary school student. Do I go to Sweden for my study abroad, or do I go to Philippines? Okay, I mean, so I think that the individual has certain constraints. I use the term tapering off of the 20th century development model, not turning away from. It will still happen, but the global part of our economy will be a smaller proportion of the whole than the regional part. Both, of course, we hope will grow. And let me give you one example, just thinking of how to make this stuff a bit more concrete. About 10 years ago, I was interviewing a major international consulting firm, you know, and my students are all MBA, so that's what I'm interested in. And they told me that I was in Kuala Lumpur, and they said that they had, I think at that time, 500 consultants, about 10 years ago, in Kuala Lumpur. And I said, why, you know, it's not a big country. He says, because, and this, they said, I didn't say, they said, Chinese Malaysians are the best labor force talent pool in the world. See, we got one here, okay? So, why? So they said, first of all, you can put them anywhere in the West, right? They speak English. You can put them in Malaysia and Indonesia, they speak Bahasa. And then they said, you can put them in China because they speak Chinese. But the interesting one, 10 years ago, the Korean chaebol were trying to restructure, so they were hiring a lot of consulting firms, international consulting firms they no longer do. The fourth thing they said, we can send them to Korea They don't know the language, they don't know the culture, but they know how to operate. Why do they know how to operate? Because of their historical circumstances, being a, I don't know, disadvantaged minority or whatever, you can put them anywhere and they will immediately figure out all the sort of social, cultural, political dynamics sufficiently for them to be a good, and these are expensive consultants, okay? And you and I probably know, I mean, one of the companies I'm on the board of, in fact, all the companies that have operations in China, always the manager is a Malaysian Chinese, right? Without degrees, by the way, without non-degree, non-graduate people. So yes, there is, I think, I have many, many other examples like this, but I think that, you know, why should a Malaysian be better than us? Right? Bilahari, where are you? Okay? And how did they, remember, the big difference between Bilahari and me, it's not a big difference, it's because he's focused on politics, on states, on sovereignty and so on. I'm focused on markets and business, okay? Where people go, who they hire, what they want to do, and that is based mainly on market forces but also on government incentives. I met many multinationals, including just this week, who say, yes, we would not be in Singapore if we did not get government incentives. It's not the right place for our kind of business, too expensive. It's such an expensive place in the world to put talent, but because the government gave us big, and you know, I do that as a corporate consultant and board member myself. You look at that, and then you look at things like the whole global thing against tax incentives, right? That Ireland being targeted by the EU for having excessively low tax breaks and so on. But luckily for both Ireland and Singapore, there are other reasons to be in Ireland besides taxes, right? Besides the low taxes. We need to have more other reasons for our own businesses and for businesses. By multinationals, I no longer mean Western, you know. There's Chinese companies, Japanese companies. My Japanese students are much more likely to say, okay, my next posting is in Indonesia. My Singapore students are much more likely to say, hey, I got a job with Amazon, goodbye. Okay? My Chinese, you know, the Chinese banks and so on come and train because they're interested in executive education, because they're interested in competing with Western companies, but this is where they are focused. Okay? Because if you're looking around and you're a Chinese global multinational, you want to globalize, sure, you globalize in Europe and you globalize in the US, but your advantages here are greater. Okay? So somehow we need to know much more about the region. To be a global city, we need to have regional advantages. Because basically the whole way the world economy is, people are looking here to our own region, and we cannot, we should be able to serve them. Sorry.
Thank you. Very good response.
Hi. My name is Dilip Nair.
Oh, yes, go
Can
ahead.
I?
Sorry, I didn't see you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hi. Kong Yam and I used to be colleagues many years ago, and always admired Kong Yam in giving very down-to-earth analogies. And I think his analogy again with the mothership is just very apt. Anyway, my question is this. In this global city and global environment, what should be the role of our government-linked companies or government-linked entities? Basically, should there be a refocus for them in terms of going out and making sure the mothership is preserved, or should there be some other reorientation? In other words, what should the role of GLCs be in this new environment? Thank you.
I think you see, if I'm running Hong Hai or I'm running Li and Fung, the financial market imperative and private sector motivation would be such that you know, I might relocate, and if it hollow out, that's too bad. Within a certain parameter, I will look at profit, shareholder value, and everything. So if I move a big part of my production of iPad, iPhone to China because my profit margin is higher rather than in Taiwan, I will do it. And so the locals in Taiwan, the new graduates, new high school graduates, not so competitive locals eventually end up in low-end job. That's too bad. That's market forces. In a way, the government-linked companies and the government institutions, partly because they survive on the long-term competitiveness and viability of the mothership, they actually, ironically, would be more willing to make adjustment to ensure that the viability of the mothership is much more supported over the longer run. So that would be in some way a potential plus within a certain limit of the effect on profit. But I think I want to make a more general point about uncertainty. As you are aware, all kinds of indicators show that the future is getting more and more uncertain. And families need security to plan. I have my children, I've got my sick father. I need some certainty and security. I cannot be in a turbulent situation all the time. I once took a small ship out in Canada to see some whale. It's not that easy, you know. When the turbulence comes, you feel very difficult, and then you started to vomit because the body cannot take that adjustment. The stress is too high. So how to stabilize ship? That's the role of the government. That is how to create certainty within the great period of rising greater uncertainty for the household and family. It's not that easy, but I think we strengthen our institutions, we make ourselves more nimble and alert, then we might be able to mitigate some of it. And that would be, I would see, the role of government should be in Singapore. You know, Singapore is not a tiger. We should be a cat. Why? Tiger, you run around and eat people. A cat is very nimble and alert. As long as the cat's muscle is well tuned, you throw the cat up into great uncertainty, the cat might be a bit frightened, meow, 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 but then he usually twists and turns, and he will land on his feet safely. And that's what we should ensure our institutions and government's role is nimble, alert, and land on our feet all the time rather than land on our stomach. Thank you.
Can I make a comment on that? Can I just make a quick comment on that? I absolutely agree. And I think one thing that didn't come out from what Kong Yam said, I don't know whether he meant, about government as a collective risk insurer, is a social safety net. The social safety net, for some reason, we have bought this sort of Western European sclerotic socialism kind of thing. A safety net, depending on how well designed it is, can actually encourage risk-taking and entrepreneurship, right? Because I know my family will not starve and be homeless just because I went out and did some venture in Vietnam. I will go and do it. But right now, from my impressions of a lot of Singaporeans are, no, I cannot. I got to pay HDB mortgage. I got to do this. That the whole system that we've created is not a social safety net, but it's actually bound people. Many Singaporean students overseas refer to it as the box. Okay? I don't want to go back into the box. And so I think that's, I don't know whether, but that I think is part of it. The second thing I want to say is to explain some of what I should say is in another chapter that's going to come out in some other SG50 book, but I don't want to say it now because the editor will kill me. But the thing is, entrepreneurship. Let's take an example of Myanmar, okay, Burma, which I have been visiting for over 30 years. About 6-7 years ago, I decided to interview Singaporean, that's like 6 or 7 years ago, when it was closed, when it was like the hardest place in the world, right? Nobody went in there, except some Japanese and Koreans protected by their industrial structure. There were already 350 Singaporean entrepreneurs there, doing all kinds of things, running spa, running trading business, etc. They were there, okay, and there's Singaporeans like this all over, not university graduate. University graduate, you can get cushy job in Singapore and MNC. Why would you go and hard life, try and make that in? Once Burma opened up, then a lot of bigger institutions, banks, IE, all kinds of other GLCs start looking in that. I haven't followed up that particular angle of it is, but I think the nimbleness comes actually from the small individual who can afford to take risk, that if they fail, they don't bring the whole company or the whole country down with them. They're trying things all the time, and enough of them who do it, enough will succeed that it will create jobs for us here as well. Okay, sorry.
Thank
Yeah.
I think Sang Nila Utama saw a cat, he didn't see a lion. We should rename our city. Anyway, thank you. Now it's time for...
Wait, there's one more question. You've
No,
been
I
waiting
think
a long time.
you had to conduct a poll somewhere.
No, still got 10 minutes. Yeah, he's got a question.
No, anyway,
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
been waiting a long time. Sorry.
Last one.
yeah, my name is Chow Yuan. I'm the CEO of Keppel Offshore and Marine. I just wanted to make a few comments. I think, first of all, Linda, I met you several years in Michigan. Nice to see you here again.
Good.
The point you make about, operating overseas, I think you have underrated also a lot of Singaporeans who are able to operate overseas effectively.
No, I agree. Yeah.
And I think one of the, we operate as offshore and marine. We have 15, we operate in 15 countries and we have 20 yards worldwide. And most of our operation, we manage with a few Singaporeans. Not a lot of Singaporeans, but a few Singaporeans. But I find that Singaporeans actually, because of our background, are able to operate in those countries actually quite well if you compare with maybe more homogeneous society like the Japanese or the Koreans, So I think just to make that point. The other thing is about Kong Yam's point about the mothership. We are in a way a GLC, as part of Keppel. But of course, we have over the years, developed this near market, near customer policy as a result of our needs to engage in the major oil and gas producing region in the world. And today, because we have been operating like this strategy for more than 20 years, and come back to the question about how to sustain the mothership. In our case, we are moving a lot of our less skill-intensive type operation overseas. For example, we have moved to Nantong, the Philippines, Indonesia, and some of the other regional places. But I think to protect the mothership, we are consciously making decisions where we keep our R&D development, our project management development, our supply chain management. I think this is very much, so I fully agree with you that I think sustaining mothership is very important. And today I think we are quite successful doing that. We have world leadership position in many areas in the offshore and marine industry. And we continue to want to maintain that policy. Thank you. Just a comment. Anyway, okay. I have to go for an analyst lunch, but I stayed on because of the question and answers. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So now I have to hand over the meeting to the...
Is it time?
Those who...
No, there's somebody with the card.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
Okay, I'll keep this short. My name's Wu Meng. I know I'm standing between everyone and lunch, which is an even more arduous task than speaking after Bilahari. The one observation that I think is very much upon us for trade and industry policy is that even among global cities are becoming commoditized because every major city wants to be a hub. And that means even as we're trying to run faster and work harder, we also need to think about things which Singapore can do which preferably no other global city can do or replicate in the short term. And I thought the iPhone example was very apt, because the iPhone is an example of how multiple disruptive technologies came together. Multi-touch, computing clouds, and now intelligent automation of things that previously a secretary or personal assistant could do. And that combined with design, which is what separated the iPod, for example, from Singapore's own MP3 player efforts years ago. So I think even as we try to strengthen the mothership, we need to think about how the mothership can boldly go where no other mothership has gone before.
Okay, thank you. Now, Tommy Singer, the first director, you can be the last speaker.
Thank you, Suan. Very happy to see you chairing this session. My question for Kong Yam actually picks up a question asked by Evelyn Goh earlier. She asked you, Kong Yam, whether you could give a positive example of a country which has successfully globalized and kept the mothership safe and sound. You didn't give her an answer. Could I ask you, would you agree that Switzerland is an example of a relatively small country that's very successfully globalized and where the mothership is in very good shape? Huh? As for Linda, I agree with Linda that we should emphasize both globalization and regionalization. I want to ask you whether you would be willing to define the region more broadly to include not just Southeast Asia, but also China and India. We have surpassed Japan to become the largest foreign investor in China, and we are also the largest investor in India. So I see the region more broadly than you do.
Okay, thank you for very good concluding comments. So now I must turn over the meeting to...
No, we haven't answered his question.
Yes.
Let him answer.
Linda, I don't want to stand between the crowd and the lunch.
No. Answer the Switzerland question. Switzerland. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to eat into your lunch. I suppose I'm here not to ask a question, but to give some comments, particularly to Kong Yam's point about, the second wing and the mothership. I agree with you clearly that you've got to protect the mothership, and you don't want the second wing to cause everything else to fly away, the so-called holding out. But the fact of the matter is, in Singapore, if you take the concept of globalization, and I gave a talk on this in September to a real estate organization, and I titled it actually Globalization and Singapore's Discontent, the topic of the talk. And basically, I think our concept of globalization started with Rajaratnam's speech in 1972, and then it was extended by our former Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew in his book, From Third World to First. And our concept of globalization is a particular concept of globalization, where you bring in MNCs from all over the world, okay? It's a one-way traffic of globalization. You bring in foreign capital, then you bring in foreign labor, and then you are the platform for them to do their things, and then they go out, And I think we are at the stage of our development now, where I think we have developed sufficient competencies that you can have a two-way globalization, that you continue to bring in that key pillar that has been our dominant strategy on bringing in foreign direct investment. But it's time for our local companies, both GLCs, as well as our SMEs, because the Singapore market is too small, and they need to go out to grow. And in fact, to Linda's point about more and more, a lot of these things are services. But the services can only be done if you go out to the host country. It's very hard to provide the services from Singapore. You can, And I agree with the point that you really got to make sure, as the gentleman from Keppel points out, you really got to keep the nerve center, the headquarters, thinking, R&D in Singapore. The problem in Singapore today, if you have too much, and I'm not, bear with me, I'm not arguing against foreign direct investment. I'm saying we should continue to encourage that, is that if you have a situation where the bulk of your talent and populations are working for other people rather than for yourself and at the highest level of strategic thinking, there's a certain element of thinking that you lose, you know. And the fact of the matter is, one of the advantages of investing overseas is there's a lot of learning about new markets, capabilities, talents, labor pools that you can apply both to your home country as well as to your companies in elsewhere, you know. So while taking your point about the second wing and the risk involved, it seems to me we are at the stage of development where the greater risk by far is not venturing out. Thank you.
Thank you, Hock Peng.
Can I quickly answer Tommy's question? Yeah. For me, China and India is part of this space, but they're part of the global. Okay, I mean, so when we say we do global stuff, we do Japan, Korea, China, India, etc. The Southeast Asia piece that I'm privileging, first of all, is the one that even the Chinese and Indians are going into, and it's the one where we are most likely to have place-specific, location-specific differentiating advantage over everybody else who's going to China and India, including big Chinese and Indian companies. So it's just a relative thing. We can't go everywhere. Where can we go that we have the biggest advantage relative to others? And sure, you can go to China and India as well, but there's a lot of competition there too.
Okay, thank you, Hock Peng. Now, she's one in Malaysia, you can take over for the last word. Yeah. No. Okay, enough. Okay, thank you. Now we are off to the voting. And I asked Din to, and meanwhile, can you join with me in giving our appreciation to Kong Yam and to Linda? I think we'll go down.
Professor Tan and Professor Lim and Dr. Lee, thank you very much. We will now have a second poll. Please get your devices ready, and the question is going to come up on the screens very shortly. And the question is, what is the best way to bolster Singapore's economy against future challenges? And your time to vote begins now. Okay, thank you everyone. So the results are now up on the screen, and we can see that many of you feel that the focus should be on strengthening governance and key institutions. That's first, and second is focus on serving the regional market. Okay, with that, we've come to the end of the first half of today's program. It's now time for lunch, and the meal will be served at the Stamford Ballroom, which will be on your left when you exit this ballroom. Please enjoy your meal, and I'll see you back here just before 1:45 p.m. Thank you.